Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for everyone for joining the virtual Kansas Corn School. This came after 4 very successful, well-attended in-person corn schools, and we wanted to keep this virtual option open for those that couldn't attend one in person, and then a chance to get some additional presenters all together. So even if you did attend one in person, hopefully can catch a different presentation here. My name is Josh Rowe, and I serve as the Vice President of Market Development and Policy for Kansas Corn. And here a little later, I'll be providing an update on some of our market development and policy updates. Just one kind of quick housekeeping item there. As you're going through the presentations tonight, if you have any questions, you can just go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring those, and we'll go from there. So we have a full slate of presenters tonight. So without further ado, we'll just start with our first one there. And I'm sorry, one other thing there, do want to put a good shout out to our sponsors, our premier sponsor, Pioneer, and then supporting sponsor Farm Credit. These are great and made possible. And then, of course, our partners at K-State Research and Extension. So through that. So our first presenter tonight is Dr. Ignacio Ciampitti, and he's going to talk about the agronomics of corn production.
Thank you very much, Josh, for the presentation and invitation, and to Kansas Corn for helping with the schools. Yes, I mean, this is the idea of these presentations are to kind of give a short update on a few key topics on the agronomic side of the corn production. We also have the chance, I mean, for a Q&A. So I know that there will be some questions, maybe all the potential questions related to some of the practices or inputs that we need to use for the next coming growing season. So this is an opportunity for many of you just to stop and then ask those questions also here in this presentation. I usually start with this slide just to refresh to everyone our growth and development. And the main point is just to start thinking about the next coming growing season and thinking about the most important topics. Most of the times I always emphasize the point of making sure to do your ABC, your basics. I mean, looking first at establishing early in the season uniform canopy, looking at seed rate and optimizing plant density is one of the key factors. Then we'll start looking at the second component on the fertilization. So I will show a little bit on aspects on that fertilization side too. And we will close a little bit about our data sets, working with Kansas Corn on the on-farm yield trials. So this slide, I mean, is usually we were updating it, and then we have more studies coming on plant density. Plant density is a key factor, but it's a key factor more when we are thinking about optimizing plant density in different environments. And I usually just provide this example as an overview of what is the optimal plant density when we are in low yielding environments. As you see, the red points on this slide, usually on the upper section, are related to low yielding environments. So in those environments, optimal densities usually are below 20,000 plants per acre. As we are pushing on plant density, we usually tend to create more stress. And then you see how the yields on that lower to below 100 bushels, they start going down. When we move to that moderate response, I mean, medium yield environments, so you start seeing that a little bit more responses on that yield. And then you start seeing that situation when we are moving to those environments that they are more than 150 to 100 bushels. So then you are seeing that response to plant density seems to be very consistent, no? And we start looking at, as we are pushing those number of plants, there are more responses on yield. In many of these environments, we tend to see that getting closer to 30,000 plants when we are trying to shoot for 200 bushels seems to be kind of a target environment. And then when we are pushing for, in situations we have availability of high natural resources, so I mean, irrigation is another key factor in many places. For those high yielding environments, that push on really high densities, I mean, that we are in 32 36,000 plants per acre is a factor to consider. And remember, on this slide, we are talking about plant density, so the number of plants that we are achieving in the field. So if you start thinking about seeding rates, depending on the condition of your planter and situation when you're planting, we usually need to think about this kind of a factor increase. I mean, sometimes between 5-10% if you are in optimal conditions. And in some environments, what you might see more problems, you might need to increase that basically seeding rate target to higher levels. So the seeding rate, we will be talking more about this. I mean, we have more research coming, and then we discuss about seeding rates in many situations, mainly just to say that it's not a number, that is a value that usually has a range. So we'll discuss it on this. And connected to that idea of this problem that is not a number, we have many studies that we have conducted. I will focus more on the Kansas side tonight. But there are many situations that we start discussing about how we can target optimal nitrogen in corn and what is the best framework. We work with some partners in multiple states, all the data coming from Kansas corn and our research projects looking at nitrogen. And then our main goal with this idea of describing more complex models is because we wanted to show to farmers that this is not just a number. We wanted to make sure that everyone understands that when you're looking at deciding your nitrogen rates, it's not just one number. And there are two components that are really hard to predict, which is the zero, which is what is the amount of yield that you can get without fertilization, and what is the optimal, which is what we call here the economic optimal nitrogen rate, EONR. And those 2 points, the zero and the EONR, are basically the key factors deciding that fertilization and the optimal nitrogen fertilization rate. And we did a study, I mean, and we start measuring the uncertainties, which basically in common and kind of a plain terms, uncertainty means when you are trying to estimate a number, how wrong that number could be, which means that if I'm trying to estimate a number for fertilization that could be 120 pounds, usually the uncertainty will tell us if that number is true and what is the range around the number. So in many of our scenarios, when we look at this uncertainty, we were seeing that usually we have uncertainties to predict fertilization and in many cases to predict the amount of nitrogen coming from soil that they were close to 40 pounds. Okay, so when you say 40 pounds, means that there are some environments. Imagine that your field one year, I mean, the amount of nitrogen coming from soil could be 50 pounds. Next year, it could be connected to 80, 90 pounds. So these are some of the things that you have in terms of uncertainty. And then in many situations, for many of us, at least unfortunately, most of these uncertainty is coming from the weather. So it's not coming from the management, but it's coming specifically mainly from the weather, which means that what happens around flowering time are basically the most critical factors limiting this problem, no? And let me show a little bit about some of the numbers that we have, no? I usually tend to show this slide as an example. Here is data set from Topeka, and it's just an example. So we have many decades of studies. This is a corn soybean rotation. So here is all the corn yield data, same experiment, multiple years. So you see all the years and you see all the response curves, and you tend to see how the optimal to nitrogen change based on the year, and change based on the year, but also change based on the environment, right? If you have a really good growing season, and if corn is growing excellent, weather conditions around flowering are excellent, your optimal fertilization will be on the higher end. And if you are in a poor environment, or if you have a stress around flowering, your optimal fertilization is on the lower end. Thus, the question is, what is the range of that optimal nitrogen? And we usually calculate that optimal, if you want to look at all the years that we were looking at this information, was close to 146 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But the range of that optimal, it was around 100 and 200, which means that if you think about deciding that optimal and looking at what is the optimal fertilization, that again shows that we have some level of variability, that depending on the growing condition, the optimal amount of nitrogen coming from soil and the yield target, that optimal fertilization can change. And it's again, not a number. So we start moving most of our research into these type of tools. Here is one example, how we can start looking at this one example that we are prototyping one of the tools. This is one of the tools that basically shows what is effect, how much nitrogen is coming from the soil without fertilization. And it's showing also how much is changing when you have different crop rotations. When you are in alfalfa, you see that many times you can achieve higher yields than when you are in a rotation that you are in, for example, corn soybean rotation, just because of that kind of a positive effect on the alfalfa. The main point for us is just to start translating our research into something that farmers and stakeholders can start playing around and taking decisions. Another tool that we're working on is also this one, and it's still kind of a prototype mode, but it's going to be out before the planting season. And then basically what this tool is showing is demonstrates, I mean, from the different studies that we have on seeing rate and also in nitrogen, it will start showing what is the optimal nitrogen rates. There is a map here that will show the different locations where they are. We have studies on seeing rate or fertility. And then it will demonstrate here basically what is the optimal recommendation, what is basically the economic optimal, and then also what is the range of that economic optimal. So stakeholders, people will be able to change the price of the fertilizer or to change the price of the cost. And this is what we need to start. We're working on is moving all this research data into basically more applied decision tools. And then I will show something that is kind of exciting. I mean, and I was thinking that was a good moment to start showing this information. When someone is thinking about corn in the future, there are many concerns about the fertilization, the amount of nitrogen, that we put in the corn and the dependency of that fertilization in corn. We are working on this for the last 2 years. This is a new hybrid that hasn't not been released yet, but basically what it shows is that this new hybrid shows that potentially we are seeing a higher increase on nitrogen uptake during the season. So most of the plant is growing, and then that nitrogen that is going inside of the plant is going to the lower leaves in the canopy. But the most relevant factor is that because we are increasing nitrogen uptake, it looks like we are also increasing in many of the environments yields. The mechanism of how the yield is going up and changing is very complex, but briefly, as we are increasing nitrogen uptake in the plant, we are basically preparing that plant to behave much better under stress conditions for flowering. And this, what we are seeing is that we're increasing the nitrogen storage before flowering, and then we are increasing the amount of reservoir that the plant has to basically face any stress after flowering. And we are comparing here just a picture to demonstrate. So here is a situation without the trait, and here is a situation with the trait. What we are starting to see is that many of these hybrids, they have the trait, they start seeing like a greenness, they close the canopy much faster, and you tend to see that those leaves are very heavy and packed in nitrogen. So if all goes under expected, I mean, it looks like this hybrid will be released in the coming years. But this is just one of the excited news on starting to see that most likely will be depending a little bit less on nitrogen. And then also we will be seeing that we are increasing that nitrogen uptake, increasing yields. And the good news for many of us here is that most of this yield increase is usually coming for environments under rain-fed conditions, and when we are below or around 150 bushels. So one of the most important aspects for corn in the last 10 years is that we tend to see more and more hybrids that they are increasing the stability, meaning that we can get better yields in under really stressed conditions. And I'll leave it to close. I mean, I usually use also as a marketing tool, but and also to showcase the importance of this. We have been partnering with Kansas Corn, excuse me, since 2008, and then 5 years already on the Kansas Corn Yield Contest. Last year data, is just released, so we will start working on that. We have close to 60 entries, similar to 2021. And most of the people will start asking, what can you learn from
yield contest data sets. And then I usually go back and I say, okay, there is a lot of things that you can learn just from looking at the yield contest data sets. And here is one example of the summary that we basically work on putting together. And if you look at basically most of the trends that we tend to see in many situations, if you look at, under rain fed in one of the scenarios or irrigated conditions, we look at under irrigation, we tend to see in many situations a little bit more conservation, tillage, higher plant densities. We always look at 30-inch row spacing. We look at longer maturity groups. So these are some of the scenarios of things that we tend to look when we are under these conditions. If you look at planting date, we are usually on planting dates. So they tend to be early, but not too early. In many situations, they are around April 16 or the end of April. And when you look at the situations on the non-irrigated, are very similar. We probably tend to see in many of those scenarios in rain-fed, lower plant densities, reduced plant densities compared to irrigated as expected. But overall, the summary in many situations is we are seeing that most frequency for conservation tillage, greater plant density and irrigation when we are targeting high yields. Most of the studies are in 30-inch, so we see very few entries on 20 or 15 inches row spacing. Most of the CRMs, relative maturity, between 113, 115, long maturing hybrids. And something that is interesting, most of the planting dates, even to get very high yields, are never really before mid-April. So if you look at the summary on other factors, on pesticide or nitrogen tests or some other elements, you start seeing this kind of a similar conditions. When you go here, we classify the entries into medium or moderate, high, and very high yields. And you will see that in many situations, what we tend to see when we are moving to high yielding situations, we tend to see, for example, more use of pesticide, and soil testing is another factor that is highly related to very high and high yielding situations. Most of those farmers, they do soil testing, they increase nitrogen rates, they make sure that they apply other elements like phosphorus. It's another element that is connected to nitrogen. So in summary, in many situations, looking at these high yielding contests, we tend to see more use of inputs, doing more soil testing, and then basically using more balanced application and balanced nutrition. And this is another summary. All the presentation we discussed about seeing rate. So here, if you look at seeing rate, data coming from farmers. If you look at that graph, it's very clear. As we are increasing yields, seeing rates are going up. I always mention this because I keep adding data every year on this graph, and then it looks like we are not moving beyond 35,000 yet. So, which means that is a number that for most of the people, when they start thinking about high yields, we have entries that are close to 300 bushels, and most of those entries, they will probably be well with 32, 33,000 seeds per acre. And planting dates, similar to what I mentioned before, mid-April. As you are delaying during the summer, then you start seeing that optimal maximum planting yield starts going down. And one of the last points, just to leave it there, is we're starting to listen more and more to what farmers are wanting to see. There is new research on late planted corn. We start working on this for the last 2 years, and then we start having really good data on results on comparing early versus late planted corn. There are some scenarios, and I'm presenting different regions on the state. There are some regions like Northeast or Southeast or East. We see no really benefits. As you can plant early, you get more yield. As you start basically delaying your planting day, you see that how yields start going down. But we start seeing that situations like in central Kansas or South Central or North Central, in some scenarios with North Central with the problem of higher probabilities of freeze. So we could push, but then you see that in North Central on this graph, when we are approaching June 1st, we start seeing that even when we are using last 30 years data of weather stations, we start seeing that we tend to see planting after June 1st, high probabilities, at least more than 5% probabilities of freeze. So finishing the crop can be an issue. But if you look at the graph on the South Central or the central portion of the states, you start to see that you can go to June or mid-June And we have, for example, in South Central, I mean, a really wide window. And not only that, it's a wide window for planting, that if you look at the yields, it doesn't seem that we are getting too much penalized by changing too much that planting date. So I know we work with some farmers in South Central that they are planting corn, and they are basically coming and trying to finish that corn and moving to wheat. So that's a good scenario for intensifying the rotations. But also, I think that this will create more opportunities for farmers that they can diversify planting times. And we are working to make sure that we can provide more information so we can start at least providing more guidance to changes, potential changes to crop insurance. So I remember this is just, I mean, to provide some insights or potential new changes or windows for planting, and then you see more opportunities on South Central Kansas, where we can see basically that planting window that is much wider than expected. I will just stop here. I think that we have a few questions, so let me see if I can get to the chat. Thanks for your time. Okay, so maybe I will start with the first one. Are you seeing many biologicals that offer true promise to assuage the need for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer? I mean, that's a really good question. I will say that, I mean, at least from the experience that we are and things that we are testing here, we are not yet seeing something that is showing us a large promise in terms of replacing nitrogen. What I show in the presentation is that, at least in this case, one of the seed companies we have worked in the past, it looks like there will be more breeding improvement from the plant, and we are seeing the positive effect of basically helping that plant to increase nitrogen capture. But I always mention something that is important. Again, two things to remember. First, nitrogen fertilization or the optimal fertilizer for corn is just not a number. I mean, I think that we need to demystify the point that people think that it's just a number that we need to remember. That number changes with the field that you're using, with the year and the environment, with the amount of contribution that could come from the soil. So it's a really moving target, and we need to really think about how we are approaching that thought process. And the second one is corn needs nitrogen. I mean, if you are thinking about planting corn, and trying to get good yields, then you need to add nitrogen. In many situations, unless you are in environments where probably you have less yield, then you might think about basically if you really need that investment. When you are basically on yield environments and there are less than 120 bushels, many of those environments, they are not limited by nitrogen. In many cases, they are limited by other factors. But in most of the environments where you want to push yields, moving that corn yield to 150, 180, 200 and plus, many of these environments, I mean, they will need nitrogen application. And so far, we haven't seen many biologicals or something that will help us to move that nitrogen requirement or reduce the amount of fertilizer. That was a really good question. So